Hey, how's it going? Welcome to No Main Opinion, the segment on this channel where I wrap up my thoughts on the playthrough I just finished. I'll go over a brief plot synopsis, discuss the art direction / identity of the game, and explore the core gameplay mechanics of it. Wrapping up with a tier list placement compared to everything else I've played for the channel up to this point. Our review this time will be covering another game out of the vaults of Game Republic, Majin and the Forsaken Kingdom. Published by Bandai Namco and released on the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2010. This story starts in a flashback, on a prosperous kingdom guarded by an ancient protector, until it is suddenly sieged by an unknown evil energy vaguely titled The Darkness. We skip forward 100 years and meet our protagonist, a young thief later named Tepei, who grew up in the forest surrounded by what animals remain, and has the innate ability to speak with any animal. It was these critters that pushed him to sneak into the ruins of the castle, in search of the Majin, the only hope of saving the realm. And it has to be him because he can understand them like the heroes of old. Plus, they're just mice and birds. What can they really do? After sneaking through the heavily guarded castle, he stumbles upon a cage housing the sleeping beast. He finds the big guy some fruit snacks, restoring just enough energy to make an escape on out of there. Once outside, our duo decides to work together to restore the kingdom to its former glory, but they'll need to travel the lands in search of Teotl's various missing powers and take down the Dark Generals protecting the inner sanctum of darkness. It's a pretty simple premise and doesn't stray too far from what the player may expect out of the introduction. Much of the storytelling is handled through these flashbacks presented in a shadow puppet style, or your typical cutscenes, exploring the past specifically surrounding the Majin's involvement leading up to the collapse, while also giving the pair moments to flesh out their relationship dynamic, showing how Teotl will do anything he can to protect those he cares for, while also just trying to end his relentless hunger, or allowing Tepei to grow from a treasure-focused thief into someone that is sure of their morals and doesn't care about money, but instead the good of many. This isn't to say the characters are these super complex personas. It's kind of the opposite, where they are pretty shallow in personality depth, not being one-note characters, but more like 3 notes at max. Tepei's growth feels expected by the end, and doesn't stray too far from the hero's journey narrative philosophy, and Teotl's personality remains largely unchanged from start to finish. My man's just wants his fruit snacks, and I get it. I felt like the dynamic between a serious guy and the big oaf helps set this apart from similarly themed titles, with some of the smaller interactions helping alleviate tension and preventing this from taking itself too seriously. I ended my playthrough around 11 hours. It's not too long, nor does any section feel like padding, as the main form of padding comes from backtracking to collect everything. It's not necessary to beat the game, but it is if you want the true ending. The story itself isn't groundbreaking, but has strong details that help keep the plot on track, feeling coherent from start to finish. It was good. I want to briefly talk about those shadow puppet flashbacks again. I really enjoyed them, in spite of how simple they appear. They remind me of Folklore's pseudo-comic style cutscenes, which I also liked. I guess I'm just a sucker for uniquely stylized cutscenes. Anyways, the setting surrounds a world run down by the darkness. Dilapidated villages, ruins, forests, overgrown jungles, many of the standard zone designs that we've become familiar with at this point. And while there are the usual suspects for backdrops, we do have a few that are somewhat fresh ideas, like the desert area having been a sea before the corruption, leading you to travel through the remains of a large beached ship to get to the boss of that zone. I think the world looks nice. It's not the prettiest or most realistic, but it is consistent from start to finish in its presentation and graphical fidelity, which in some cases is more than we can say about current releases. Every location has just enough detail to them to warrant exploring every corner, yet also push the player to continue forward exploring the rest of the connected rooms. Rather than true dungeons, the world is split off into many different rooms, typically connected by doors the Majin can open or long scenic paths, with no two rooms feeling identical, despite sharing similar themes. I would imagine this stems from the lack of NPCs and a need for town hubs, with the woodland critters serving as the context clue givers. I thought the enemy designs were pretty strong. Every enemy is a different inhabitant of the world, possessed by the shadow pollutant the darkness emits. From normal people to monkeys to wolf-like creatures. While there aren't a ton of different designs, new ones are introduced in every area all the way up until the final boss starts. The bosses are also corrupted, but are all drastically different from their old human forms, being large monstrosities occupying their own arenas. I just don't quite get what they were thinking for the final boss. I just think it's kind of gross. Worst design in my opinion. Combat has two styles to it. One where Teotl is fighting with you, and the other where Tepeyu is alone. In most fights, the two work together to beat up the Warriors of Darkness. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Where the game sets itself apart, though, is how you coordinate your actions with Teotl. He isn't controllable like Tepeyu is. Instead, he's a pretty simple AI that you give commands to in order to get him to do what you want. While this is focused on more outside of combat, in combat you control when he uses his elemental powers, each interacting in different ways with the enemy and the player, such as lighting the player on fire to spread that between enemies, or using your weapon as a lightning rod to stun enemies. Once they're sufficiently stunned, our boys perform a combination attack, a grand finale of sorts, dealing a ton of damage and a big impact. The biggest ones incorporating his elements into them in some sort of extra way. Fights end up with this flow of using abilities to stun and then chaining combinations until everything is dead. I thought it was fun, but I can see how it would be seen as repetitive. Every boss fight plays out more like a puzzle, figuring out how to initiate damage phase, all centering around Teotl's powers. This isn't a new concept, but the puzzles associated with these bosses do feel different enough. They aren't that difficult, but when half of the user's interactions are revolving around this clumsy tree bear, I'd bet difficulty wasn't the biggest concern. Outside of the main fights, Tepeyu does get separated from the Majin here and there, requiring him to take a more stealthy approach. Now, this isn't Metal Gear Solid or Dishonored, but you do have to be mindful of patrol patterns and take advantage of stealth takedowns when you can. Otherwise, you will get overrun by the enemies. Aside from fighting endless waves of shadow soldiers, most of your time consists of figuring out the many environmental puzzles and general platforming. Every room has some way to limit your progress, most of which can be resolved with the Majin's powers, or through a bit of clever thinking. There aren't any groundbreaking themes to these puzzles. Most are pretty straightforward and easy to figure out. This facet of gameplay is where you spend the most time commanding Teotl around, whether to hold the weight down for a catapult or rotating a windmill platform manually that Tepeyu couldn't even budge. Every room has between 3 and 5 collectibles to search out. Some require a bit of thought to get, some are just out in the open with no challenge, and some are even locked away by progression. I enjoyed the puzzles, and the rewards felt gratifying to collect, but the amount of backtracking required to get everything seemed tedious. Despite not having direct control over Teotl, I didn't really have any problems with the AI. In most situations he did exactly what I told him, or at least what was better for the situation. There were some quirks here and there, especially with his targeting or lack of consistency. It's mostly his constant chirping that wore at me. Not enough to hinder my enjoyment, but sigh-inducing nonetheless. So, the best way I can summarize it is this. Majin knows what its game identity is, and stays within that lane, doing everything well, achieving a finished game that is enjoyable for what it is. It tries new things, but doesn't go beyond the scope of what it's comfortable with, delivering a strong storytelling experience without gorging you on an endless buffet of lore and backstory. And I find that refreshing. I really enjoyed this. It was the refresh I needed after that dog water game before this. I have a soft spot for the big guy after this adventure. He's definitely the most memorable part of the game. Not the best part, but the one I'll associate this game with. This is probably my favorite escort quest to date, and I can't think of a better one off the top of my head. The combat is solid, feeling a bit better than their past works, despite still faltering in the hit detection area, with a pretty satisfying magic system once you get the hang of it. The puzzles were also good, not overly repetitive or tedious. The collectibles are satisfying to get, but the backtracking is very long and arduous process if you aren't diligently clearing the map. I'd give it a low A. It isn't perfect, but it was a joy to finally beat this, and was quite fun to play through. Just a good game all around. If you enjoy the Zelda series, but want something that's just different, but still familiar, I'd say this hits that itch. Or, if you just want a story to play through that isn't too heavy or long, then this fits the bill as well. Up next, I am Setsuna. Anyways, thanks for listening.